Steve Harvey had seen countless contestants walk across the Family Feud stage over his years of hosting, but when 95-year-old Robert Chen shuffled to the podium with his walker on that autumn afternoon in October 2024, something about the moment felt different. The studio audience grew quiet as the elderly man made his way slowly but purposefully to his position, his family members standing supportively behind him. Robert wore a crisp white button-down shirt with a navy cardigan, and despite his advanced age, his eyes held a clarity and determination that immediately caught Steve's attention. The Chen family from Sacramento, California, had already won their main game and were now preparing for the fast money round. But it was clear from the atmosphere in the studio that this was going to be more than just another segment of television entertainment. Steve approached Robert with his characteristic warmth, but he adjusted his usual energetic style out of respect for the elderly contestant. Robert's grandson had completed the first fast money round with a solid score of 137 points, which meant Robert needed only 63 points to secure the $20,000 prize for his family. The cameras captured every detail as Steve gently placed his hand on Robert's shoulder and asked if he was ready to play. Robert nodded slowly, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the podium for support. His voice, though aged and slightly raspy, carried a surprising strength when he spoke. He told Steve that he was ready, and that he had been preparing for this moment in ways Steve could not yet understand. The audience sensed something profound was about to unfold, and even the production crew seemed to lean in with heightened attention. Before starting the questions, Steve engaged in his typical pre-game conversation, asking Robert about his family and what had brought them to Family Feud. Robert's response was measured and thoughtful. He explained that his late wife, Margaret, had always loved watching game shows, particularly Family Feud, and that she had made him promise something important before she passed away 18 months earlier. Steve's expression softened immediately at the mention of Robert's late wife, and he asked gently what Margaret had been like. Robert's eyes brightened despite the sadness that flickered across his face. He described Margaret as the light of his life for 72 years of marriage, a woman who had immigrated with him from Taiwan in 1953 when they were both young and full of dreams. She had worked alongside him in their small grocery store, raised their 4 children, and built a life in America that neither of them could have imagined when they first arrived with barely enough money to survive. The audience was completely silent now, drawn into Robert's story with the kind of genuine interest that cannot be manufactured. Steve asked Robert what promise he had made to Margaret, and the elderly man's response created an immediate shift in the emotional temperature of the entire studio. Robert said that Margaret had made him promise that if he ever got the chance to be on Family Feud, he would tell the world a secret she had kept for their entire marriage, a secret that she felt could help other families, but that she had been too afraid to share while she was alive. Steve's eyebrows raised in surprise, but he maintained his composure and asked Robert if he wanted to share that secret now. Robert shook his head slightly and said that he would share it after the fast money round, that Margaret had been specific about the order of things because she believed the story would mean more if people understood the full context first. Steve agreed to Robert's request, and they proceeded with the fast money questions. The format was simple and familiar, but watching Robert answer felt like witnessing something more significant than a game show segment. Steve asked him to name a popular pizza topping, and Robert responded immediately with pepperoni. When asked to name something people do at the beach, Robert said swim. For a gift people give on Valentine's Day, he answered flowers. When asked how many hours people spend watching television each day, Robert said 3 hours. Finally, when asked to name something people save money for, Robert answered education. His responses were delivered with a calm confidence that seemed unusual for someone his age playing a fast-paced game, and as each answer was revealed, the audience erupted with increasing enthusiasm. Pepperoni was the number one answer with 41 points. Swimming was number one with 36 points. Flowers earned the top spot with 48 points. 3 hours of television watching was the number two answer with 27 points. Education was the number one answer with 39 points. Robert had scored 191 points on his own, bringing the family total to 328 points, one of the highest scores in Family Feud history. The audience leaped to their feet in celebration, and Robert's family rushed to embrace him with tears streaming down their faces. But Robert himself remained remarkably composed, nodding quietly as if he had expected this outcome all along. Steve looked genuinely amazed by what had just occurred, but before he could begin his usual celebration, Robert raised his hand slightly to ask for Steve's attention. The gesture was so gentle, yet commanding, that the entire studio fell silent again within seconds. Robert said that he needed to fulfill his promise to Margaret now, and that what he was about to share was the real reason they had come on the show. Steve moved closer to Robert, his expression showing a mixture of curiosity and concern. He told Robert that he had the floor, and that everyone was listening. Robert took a deep breath, and when he began speaking, his voice carried the weight of 7 decades of lived experience. He explained that when he and Margaret came to America from Taiwan in 1953, they faced discrimination and hardship that was difficult for younger generations to fully comprehend. They could not rent apartments in certain neighborhoods, banks would not loan them money to start a business, and many Americans viewed them with suspicion simply because of where they had come from. Despite these obstacles, they managed to open a small grocery store in a predominantly white neighborhood, determined to prove that they could contribute positively to their new country. The challenges they faced were relentless. Robert described how some customers would refuse to be served by Margaret, demanding to speak only with him. Others would deliberately create problems in the store, claiming they had been shortchanged or that products were spoiled, forcing Robert and Margaret to provide refunds they could not afford. The couple worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, sleeping in a small room behind the store because they could not yet afford separate housing. They lived this way for 3 years, slowly building their business despite the constant discrimination and financial pressure. During this time, Margaret discovered she was pregnant with their first child, and this news brought both joy and terror. They had barely enough money to feed themselves, let alone support a baby, and Margaret's pregnancy was complicated by health issues that required medical attention they could not afford. Robert paused in his story, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The studio remained absolutely silent, with camera operators and crew members visibly moved by what they were hearing. Steve stood beside Robert with his hand on the elderly man's shoulder, providing silent support as the story continued. Robert explained that in the spring of 1956, when Margaret was 7 months pregnant and struggling with severe complications, a customer came into their store late one evening. This customer was an elderly white woman named Dorothy, who lived in the neighborhood and had been watching the young couple's struggles with growing concern. Dorothy asked Margaret directly if she needed help, and Margaret, exhausted and frightened, broke down and admitted that she did not know how they would afford the medical care she needed or how they would care for their baby once it arrived. What happened next, Robert said, was something that Margaret had made him promise to keep secret until after her death, because she felt that revealing it earlier would diminish the gift they had been given. Dorothy told Margaret and Robert that she had lost her own son in World War II, and that watching them work so hard and face so much prejudice had reminded her that kindness transcended racial and cultural boundaries. Dorothy revealed that she was quite wealthy, though she lived modestly, and she offered to pay for all of Margaret's medical expenses and to provide the couple with enough money to hire help for the store, so Margaret could rest during the final months of her pregnancy. Robert and Margaret were overwhelmed by this generosity and tried to refuse, insisting they would find a way on their own. But Dorothy was firm in her offer, telling them that refusing help when it was genuinely offered was a form of pride that served no one. Dorothy did more than just pay for medical expenses. Over the next 15 years, until her death in 1971, she became like a grandmother to the Chen children and a mother figure to Robert and Margaret. She taught Margaret English and helped her understand American customs and culture. She introduced Robert to other business owners who became important customers and allies. She attended every school event for the Chen children and celebrated every holiday with the family. Most importantly, Dorothy used her standing in the community to advocate for the Chen family, gently but firmly educating her neighbors about the value of embracing diversity and supporting immigrant families who were working hard to build better lives. The secret that Margaret had asked Robert to reveal was this: Dorothy had paid for all 4 of the Chen children to attend college, an expense that would have been impossible for Robert and Margaret to manage on their own. Dorothy had insisted that this gift remain anonymous during her lifetime, and even after her death, with only Margaret, Robert, and the accountant who managed the education fund knowing the truth. The Chen children had been told that their parents had saved diligently for their education, which was partially true, but the bulk of the funding had come from Dorothy's quiet generosity. Margaret had agreed to keep this secret because Dorothy believed that the children should grow up feeling proud of their parents' sacrifices rather than feeling indebted to a benefactor they barely knew. Dorothy had made Margaret promise that she would only reveal the truth when she felt the time was right, when the story could serve as an example of how kindness across cultural boundaries could transform lives and communities. Steve Harvey stood speechless for several long moments, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. He asked Robert why Margaret had chosen to reveal this secret now, 18 months after her passing. Robert smiled for the first time since beginning his story and explained that Margaret had always believed that America was at its best when people saw past their differences and supported one another. She had watched the news in her final years with growing sadness, seeing communities divide along racial and cultural lines, watching people retreat into fear and suspicion of those who looked or spoke differently. Margaret told Robert in her final days that she wanted their story shared as a reminder that ordinary people had the power to change lives through simple acts of kindness, and that prejudice and discrimination could be overcome when individuals chose to see the humanity in others rather than focusing on differences. Margaret had specifically requested that Robert share this story on Family Feud, because she had always loved how the show brought together families from all backgrounds and celebrated their unique stories. She felt that a platform like this, where millions of people watched families compete and celebrate together, was the perfect place to remind viewers that building bridges across cultural divides was not just possible, but essential. Margaret had told Robert that she wanted people to know about Dorothy, not to praise Margaret and Robert for receiving help, but to inspire others to be like Dorothy, to look around their communities and find families who might need support, encouragement, or simply someone who saw their worth and their struggles. The cameras captured tears streaming down faces throughout the studio. Steve Harvey pulled Robert into a careful embrace, mindful of the elderly man's frailty. When Steve stepped back, he addressed the audience and the cameras directly, his voice carrying a power that came from genuine emotion rather than performance. He said that in all his years of television, he had never heard a story that so perfectly captured what America should aspire to be. He talked about how Dorothy had chosen to see past the prejudices of her time and recognize a young couple who simply needed a chance to prove themselves. He spoke about how Margaret and Robert had honored Dorothy's gift by raising children who went on to become productive citizens, contributing to their communities. He emphasized that the Chen family's success was not just about individual achievement, but about what became possible when people refused to let fear and prejudice dictate their actions. Steve then revealed something that the audience had not known. He explained that the production team had done research on the Chen family before the show, and he had learned that Robert and Margaret's 4 children had all become professionals who spent their careers serving others. Their oldest son was a doctor who had spent 30 years providing medical care in underserved communities. Their oldest daughter was a teacher who had dedicated her life to educating immigrant children and helping them adapt to American schools. Their younger daughter was a civil rights attorney who worked on cases defending immigrants facing discrimination. Their youngest son was a social worker who ran programs helping elderly immigrants navigate the complexities of American healthcare and social services. Each of the Chen children, Steve noted, had built their careers around serving others and breaking down barriers, living out the values that Dorothy had modeled and that Margaret and Robert had instilled in them. Steve announced that he wanted to honor both Dorothy's memory and Margaret's final wish. He revealed that his foundation would be establishing the Dorothy and Margaret Legacy Fund, designed to provide educational support for immigrant families facing financial hardship. The fund would specifically focus on helping first-generation immigrants attend college, recognizing that education was often the key to transforming not just individual lives, but entire communities. Steve said that the $20,000 the Chen family had won would be the first contribution to this fund, and he challenged viewers to add their support. He expressed his belief that Margaret would have approved of using their winnings this way, turning a game show prize into seed money for a movement that could help hundreds of families over time. Robert listened to Steve's announcement with quiet dignity, then asked if he could say one more thing. Steve immediately agreed, and Robert addressed the camera directly. He spoke about how Dorothy had once told him that she helped their family not because she wanted gratitude or recognition, but because she believed that was what decent people should do for one another. Dorothy had said that she was not a hero or a saint, just someone who had the resources to help and chose to use them. Robert emphasized this point carefully, explaining that Dorothy's greatness was not in her wealth, but in her willingness to see past the cultural boundaries that divided her from a young immigrant couple. He said that every person watching had the ability to be like Dorothy, regardless of their financial circumstances, because the most valuable thing Dorothy had given them was not money, but recognition of their humanity and worth. Robert then shared advice that Margaret had asked him to pass along. She had wanted people to understand that receiving help was not a sign of weakness, but a necessary part of the human experience, and that refusing to accept assistance when genuinely offered often came from pride rather than strength. Margaret believed that American culture sometimes overemphasized individual self-reliance to the point where people suffered needlessly rather than accepting support from their communities. She had wanted to acknowledge publicly that she and Robert could not have achieved what they did without Dorothy's help, and that admitting this truth took nothing away from their hard work and determination. Margaret felt strongly that sharing stories of interdependence and mutual support was crucial for building the kind of communities where everyone could thrive. The impact of Robert's revelation extended far beyond that day's taping. When the episode aired 3 weeks later, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The segment went viral within hours, with millions of people sharing the story across social media platforms. News outlets picked up the story and featured it in broadcasts and articles examining themes of immigration, generosity, and cross-cultural understanding. The Dorothy and Margaret Legacy Fund received donations from across the country, with people contributing everything from small amounts to substantial gifts. Within 2 months, the fund had collected over $500,000, enough to provide educational support for dozens of immigrant students. The Chen family received thousands of messages from viewers who shared their own stories of how kindness from unexpected sources had changed their lives. Many people wrote about times when they had been helped by someone from a different background, or when they had chosen to help someone despite cultural differences. Some shared stories of regret, admitting that they had missed opportunities to support others because they had allowed prejudice or fear to guide their decisions. The common thread through nearly all these messages was a renewed commitment to building bridges across cultural divides and looking for opportunities to support others in their communities. Educational institutions began using Robert's story as a teaching tool in classes about immigration history, social justice, and community building. Professors noted that the story provided a powerful counter-narrative to simplistic historical accounts that portrayed immigrant experiences as purely about individual determination and hard work. The story illustrated how success often depended on finding allies who were willing to challenge the discriminatory structures of their time and use their privilege to create opportunities for others. Students discussed how Dorothy's actions represented not just personal kindness, but a form of practical anti-racism that involved risk, ongoing commitment, and genuine relationship building rather than abstract goodwill. Several churches, synagogues, mosques, and other faith communities organized programs inspired by the Dorothy and Margaret Legacy Fund, creating local initiatives to support immigrant families in their areas. These programs took various forms, from tutoring services and language classes to mentorship programs and emergency financial assistance funds. Religious leaders noted that the story resonated with core teachings across many faith traditions about welcoming strangers and supporting the vulnerable. The story provided a concrete example of how these principles could be lived out in ways that transformed both the giver and the receiver. 6 months after Robert's appearance on Family Feud, the show did a follow-up segment that brought together several families who had been helped by the Dorothy and Margaret Legacy Fund. The segment featured a young woman from Somalia whose medical school tuition had been partially covered by the fund, a family from Guatemala whose son's engineering degree was made possible through the fund's support, and a Vietnamese family whose daughter received help completing her nursing degree. Each family shared how the financial support had been crucial, but equally important was the message behind the gift, that their struggles and dreams mattered to complete strangers who chose to invest in their success. During this follow-up segment, Robert appeared again, this time surrounded by his entire extended family, including his 4 children, 14 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. The visual image of this multi-generational family was powerful, representing the long-term impact of Dorothy's decision to help 2 struggling immigrants 70 years earlier. Steve Harvey pointed out that Dorothy's initial investment in the Chen family had multiplied across generations, with descendants who were now doctors, teachers, attorneys, social workers, engineers, artists, and business owners. He calculated that the Chen family had collectively spent over 400 years serving their communities in various professional capacities, an impressive legacy that traced back to one woman's decision to extend kindness across cultural boundaries. Robert's oldest son spoke during the follow-up segment, sharing what it had meant to learn the truth about Dorothy's role in their family's success. He admitted that his initial reaction had been complicated, feeling simultaneously grateful for Dorothy's generosity and somewhat unsettled by learning that his parents had kept this significant secret for so long. However, after reflecting on his mother's reasoning for revealing the truth posthumously, he had come to appreciate the wisdom in her approach. Growing up believing that his parents had single-handedly provided for their education had instilled a strong work ethic and sense of family responsibility. Learning later about Dorothy's contribution had added a layer of understanding about interdependence and the importance of using one's own success to help others, just as Dorothy had done for his family. The segment concluded with the announcement that the Dorothy and Margaret Legacy Fund had grown substantially and was now partnering with several universities to provide ongoing scholarship support. The fund had also inspired similar initiatives across the country, with dozens of communities establishing their own programs to support immigrant families. Steve Harvey emphasized that this multiplication of impact was exactly what Margaret had hoped would result from sharing their story. She had understood that people needed concrete examples of how kindness could create lasting change, and that seeing such examples could inspire others to act in their own communities. As the years passed, Robert's story became a touchstone in discussions about immigration, integration, and community building. The story was particularly valuable because it avoided simplistic narratives while honestly portraying both the challenges immigrant families faced and the crucial role that allies from the dominant culture could play in creating pathways to success. The story acknowledged discrimination and hardship without descending into victimhood, and it celebrated generosity and kindness without ignoring the structural barriers that made such help necessary in the first place. Robert lived for 3 more years after his Family Feud appearance, passing away peacefully at age 98, surrounded by his family. His obituary, published in newspapers across the country, focused not just on his own accomplishments, but on his role as the keeper and eventual sharer of Margaret and Dorothy's story. The obituary noted that Robert had spent his final years speaking at schools, community centers, and faith gatherings, always emphasizing the same themes that Margaret had wanted him to share. That kindness across cultural boundaries could transform lives, that accepting help was not weakness, and that every person had the power to be like Dorothy by choosing to see and respond to the needs of others in their communities. The Dorothy and Margaret Legacy Fund continues to operate, now managed by the Chen family's second generation. The fund has helped hundreds of immigrant students pursue higher education, and each recipient is asked to share their own story of how they have been helped by others and how they plan to use their education to serve their communities. This storytelling component was inspired by Margaret's belief that sharing these narratives was essential for building the kind of society where mutual support across cultural boundaries became normal rather than exceptional. Steve Harvey has frequently referenced Robert's appearance on Family Feud in interviews and speeches, describing it as one of the most meaningful moments in his broadcasting career. He has said that Robert's story changed his understanding of what his platform could accomplish, pushing him to think more deliberately about using his shows to highlight stories that could inspire positive social change. The bangle he received from Priya and the memory of Robert's revelation have both become touchstones in his career, reminding him that television at its best could be a force for connection and understanding across the boundaries that too often divide communities. The story of Robert Chen, his late wife Margaret, and the woman who changed their lives continues to resonate because it addresses fundamental questions about how communities should function, how success should be understood, and what obligations people have to support one another across lines of difference. The story refuses easy answers while pointing toward practical wisdom, that building inclusive communities requires intentional effort from those with privilege and power, that acknowledging interdependence strengthens rather than weakens individuals and families, and that the effects of kindness can multiply across generations in ways that transform entire communities. Margaret's final secret, shared by her devoted husband on national television, became a gift to millions, offering both inspiration and practical guidance for creating the kind of society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, regardless of where they come from or what they look like.